Case 1. Mandie Miller. The Child in the U-Haul. Airway Heights, Washington, September 2022. There are cases in true crime that shock you. There are cases that disturb you. There are cases that keep you awake at 3 in the morning, turning details over in your mind, trying to find the angle that makes it make sense, the perspective that renders the incomprehensible at least partially comprehensible. And then there are cases that reach inside your chest and rearrange something permanently. Cases that change the way you see the world in a way that cannot be undone. Cases that you carry with you long after you have closed the file, turned off the screen, and gone back to the ordinary business of your daily life. The case of Mila Miller is one of those cases. And the reason it sits so differently from so many other cases we have covered on this channel, the reason it occupies a particular and especially disturbing corner of the true crime landscape, is not just because of what was done to this little girl. It is because of who did it. It is because of the relationship at the center of the case. It is because of the word that describes how Mandie Miller came to be in Mila Miller's life in the first place. That word is family. Mandie Miller was not a stranger who entered Mila's life through some random intersection of circumstances. She was not a neighbor, not a family friend, not someone who came into contact with this child through a system or a program or an institution. Mandie Miller was Mila Miller's biological aunt. She was blood. She was someone who had known Mila since the moment Mila entered the world. Someone who had looked at this child as an infant and made the decision, the active, deliberate, legally documented decision, to bring her into her home and call her daughter. Adoption is not a passive act. It is not something that happens to a person by accident or by default. It requires intention. It requires paperwork and home studies and background checks and the scrutiny of multiple systems specifically designed to evaluate whether the person seeking to adopt is capable of providing a safe, stable, nurturing environment for a child. Mandie Miller went through all of that. She was evaluated. She was assessed. She was deemed suitable by the people whose job it was to make that determination. And she was granted legal guardianship over a child who was also her niece, her family, someone she had a biological connection to that predated and went deeper than the legal one. And then, according to everything the investigation and the criminal proceedings that followed would reveal, she used that guardianship, that sacred, hard-won, legally sanctioned responsibility, not to protect Mila, not to nurture her, not to give her the childhood she deserved, but to destroy her. Slowly, deliberately, in the privacy of a home in Airway Heights, Washington, a small community just west of Spokane in the eastern part of the state, far from the eyes of anyone who might have intervened. Mila Miller was 8 years old. 8 years old is second or third grade. 8 years old is loose teeth and chapter books and arguments about bedtime and the beginning of the friendships that shape who we become. It is the age where children are just starting to develop a genuine sense of their own identity, their own preferences, their own personality separate from the adults around them. It is one of the most vibrantly alive seasons of childhood, full of curiosity and energy, and the particular kind of joy that belongs exclusively to children who have not yet learned that the world can be a place of profound cruelty. Inside the home in Airway Heights, Mila was not living that childhood. She was not going to school and making friends and coming home to a hot meal and a mother who asked about her day. She was not experiencing any of the ordinary, beautiful, mundane things that 8-year-olds across this country experience every single day without giving them a second thought. She was being starved, systematically, deliberately, over a prolonged period of time that investigators would later work carefully to establish. She was being denied the food that her growing body needed to survive. And alongside the starvation, she was being subjected to physical abuse that left her body marked with multiple untreated injuries. Injuries that were never taken to a doctor, never shown to a nurse, never allowed to be seen by any outside eyes whatsoever. Because outside eyes would have meant questions. Outside eyes would have meant mandatory reporters doing exactly what mandatory reporters are trained to do. Outside eyes would have ended what was happening to Mila far sooner than it ultimately did. But there were no outside eyes. There was only the inside of that house. And inside that house, Mila Miller's body told the story that her voice was never allowed to tell. By the time Mila Miller died, sometime in September of 2022 in Airway Heights, Washington, she weighed 26 pounds. Read that again. 26 pounds. The average weight of a healthy, well-nourished 3-year-old child is approximately 30 pounds. Mila was 8 years old. A healthy 8-year-old girl should weigh somewhere between 45 and 65 pounds, depending on her height and build. Mila weighed 26. She had been starved to a weight that was not merely unhealthy. It was incompatible with the continued functioning of an 8-year-old human body. She had been starved past the point where her body could compensate, past the point where any reserves remained, past the point of survival. She had been starved until she died. 26 pounds. Let that number sit with you as we continue. Let it anchor everything that comes after it, because it is the number that tells you more about what Mila Miller's daily existence was like inside that Airway Heights home than any other single piece of information in this case. It tells you how long it went on. It tells you how deliberate it was. It tells you that this was not a household struggling to put food on the table. This was a household where food was deliberately withheld from a child, while that child wasted away to 26 pounds, and no one did anything to stop it. And when Mila finally died, when her small, depleted, 26-pound body finally gave out from everything that had been done to it, Mandie Miller did not call 911. She did not call emergency services. She did not run to a neighbor. She did not fall apart in the way that any parent who has lost a child, even a parent who contributed to that loss, typically falls apart in the immediate aftermath of a child's death. She did not do anything that a grieving, panicked, even guilty mother would do in the face of the death of her child. Instead, she called Alexander Kermoirov, her boyfriend, and together, the two of them made a plan. Not a plan to get help, not a plan to come clean, not a plan that involved Mila Miller receiving in death the dignity she had been denied in life. They made a plan to run. They loaded Mila's body, the body of an 8-year-old little girl, 26 pounds, multiple untreated injuries, dead from the accumulated effects of prolonged starvation and abuse, into a U-Haul trailer. And then they drove. They pulled that trailer down the highway and they drove west through Washington state, through the landscapes that most people see and experience as some of the most beautiful scenery in the entire country. And then they kept driving. They crossed into Idaho. They crossed into Montana. They moved through Wyoming. They pushed on into South Dakota. More than 1,100 miles across multiple state lines, with the body of an 8-year-old child in the trailer behind them, as though she were furniture, as though she were cargo, as though what was in that U-Haul was not a little girl who had been alive just days before, as though she were nothing. Think about what that drive looks like from the inside. Think about the hours that passed. Think about the miles accumulating on the odometer. Think about the fact that at every single exit, at every single rest stop, at every single moment during that 1,100-mile drive, both Mandie Miller and Alexander Kermoirov had the opportunity to stop, to turn around, to do the one thing that might have, at that late and irreversible stage, restored even a small fragment of dignity to Mila Miller's story. They chose, at every single one of those moments, to keep going. In December of 2022, law enforcement caught up with them in South Dakota. They were apprehended. Mila's body was recovered from the trailer. And the investigation that began in the immediate aftermath of that arrest, the painstaking, methodical, heartbreaking work of detectives and forensic specialists and medical examiners working backward from what they found, built a picture of what life had been like for Mila Miller in the months and years leading up to her death that would later be presented in a Washington state courtroom in terms that left observers struggling to hold themselves together. The case moved through the legal system over the years that followed. There were hearings and motions, and all of the procedural machinery of the criminal justice process doing the work it was designed to do. Witnesses were interviewed. Evidence was cataloged. The full scope of what had happened inside that Airway Heights home was painstakingly assembled from physical evidence, forensic analysis, and the accounts of people who had had any contact with Mila in the period leading up to her death. And then, on February 6, 2026, in a Washington state courtroom, it was over. Mandie Miller stood before a judge. The evidence of what she had done, the starvation that reduced an 8-year-old to 26 pounds, the untreated injuries, the death itself, and then the 1,100-mile drive with Mila's body in a trailer, had been laid before the court in full. And the judge imposed a sentence of 32 years in prison. 32 years. For Mila. For 26 pounds. For every untreated injury. For 1,100 miles of driving with a dead child in a trailer, as though she were cargo, as though she were nothing, as though she were not the whole world she should have been to the woman behind the wheel. Mila Miller was 8 years old. She deserved birthday parties and scraped knees and school plays and the particular magic of Christmas morning and every single ordinary, beautiful, boring, irreplaceable thing that childhood is made of. She deserved someone who would have moved heaven and earth to keep her safe. She deserved the love that was supposed to come automatically with the word family. She deserved a mother. Instead, she got Mandie Miller. And the world is poorer and darker and less for what that meant. We will never forget her name. If this case moved you, please take a moment right now to hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to the children whose stories we tell here. Every subscription tells the algorithm to show these stories to more people, and more people knowing Mila's name is a form of justice. Subscribe so you never miss a case. Case 2, Carri Williams. The Child Who Walked in the Rain. Sedro-Woolley, Washington, May 12, 2011. There is a particular kind of tragedy that belongs to the story of children who cross oceans in search of something better. Children who are born into circumstances of poverty or instability or loss, who are identified by the international adoption system as children in need of permanent families, who go through the lengthy and complex process of inter-country adoption and arrive in a new country, in a new home, with a new family, carrying with them the profound and entirely reasonable hope that the worst is behind them, that the crossing was worth it, that what awaits them on the other side of all that distance and change and uncertainty is safety, is warmth, is love. Hannah Grace Rose Williams carried that hope. She carried it from Ethiopia across the Atlantic and into Skagit County, Washington, into a home in the quiet community of Sedro-Woolley, nestled in the shadow of the North Cascades. She carried it through the early months of her placement with the Williams family, through the process of learning a new language and adjusting to a new culture and navigating the enormous complexity of becoming part of a household that was not the one she was born into. She carried that hope because hope is what children have. It is often the only thing that children in difficult circumstances have, and they hold it with a tenacity and a faithfulness that most adults have long since lost the capacity for. She was 13 years old when that hope ran out. Carri Williams and her husband Larry Williams had adopted Hannah from Ethiopia. On the surface, on the paperwork, in the presentation they made to the adoption system, they were a stable, faith-based household in rural Washington state, the kind of family that adoption agencies look for when they are placing vulnerable children. The kind of family that, from the outside, appears to offer exactly the kind of safe, structured, loving environment that a child coming from difficult circumstances needs most. But what was happening inside the Williams home bore no resemblance to that surface presentation. By the time investigators began the work of piecing together what Hannah's daily life had looked like inside that household, the picture that emerged was one of sustained, systematic cruelty that had been concealed behind closed doors and the appearance of normalcy. Hannah had been denied adequate food. Not occasionally. Not in the way that busy or struggling families sometimes fall short of providing optimal nutrition. She had been deliberately, systematically denied the food that her body needed to grow and thrive and function. She had been subjected to physical punishment that went so far beyond any reasonable standard of discipline that it constituted abuse by any legal, medical, or moral measure. She had been denied warmth. She had been denied the basic comforts and dignities that every child, everywhere, deserves simply by virtue of being alive and being a child. She had been treated, in her own home, not as a daughter but as something far, far less. On May 12, 2011, Hannah Grace Rose Williams died. She died outside. She died in the backyard of the Williams home in Sedro-Woolley. She died in the rain, in the mud, in the cold Pacific Northwest night air, alone, in the dark, outside the house where she had been brought to build a better life. Her core body temperature was critically low. She was 13 years old, and she weighed 58 pounds. 58 pounds. For a 13-year-old girl. The average healthy weight for a 13-year-old girl is somewhere between 80 and 100 pounds, depending on height and build. Hannah weighed 58. The gap between those numbers is not a gap that opens up through ordinary hardship or circumstance. It is a gap that opens up through sustained, prolonged, deliberate denial of food and care. It is the physical record, written on the body of a child, of what was being done to her inside that house. The medical examiner determined that Hannah died from hypothermia. Her body temperature had dropped so low that her organs could no longer sustain her life. Malnutrition was identified as a significant contributing factor because her body had so few reserves left, had been so depleted by months and years of inadequate nutrition, that it had no capacity to generate the heat it needed to survive exposure to the cold. She died from the cold because she had been starved. She had been starved because someone in that house chose, every single day, not to feed her. She was outside in the rain because that is where she had been sent. She died there because no one brought her in. The investigation that followed Hannah's death was extensive and deeply painful. Investigators interviewed other children who had lived in the Williams household. They gathered testimony about what daily life inside that home had looked like. They documented a pattern of treatment that extended beyond Hannah to other children in the household, but that was, by every account and every piece of evidence gathered, most severe in its application to Hannah. She had been singled out. She had been treated differently from the other children in the home in ways that the evidence made clear were not accidental and were not the product of oversight. She had been the particular target of a sustained campaign of abuse and neglect that had been going on for long enough to reduce her body to 58 pounds before it finally killed her. She had been forced to sleep in an outbuilding, a structure outside the main house, separate from the warmth and comfort that the other members of the household enjoyed. She had been denied the meals that the other children received. She had been subjected to physical discipline that was, by any standard, abusive, excessive in its application, cruel in its intent, and utterly disproportionate to any behavior that could conceivably be used to justify it. And all of it had been hidden. All of it had taken place in the space between the face the Williams family presented to the outside world and the reality of what was happening behind their closed doors. Carri Williams was arrested in September of 2011, several months after Hannah's death. The charge that was brought against her, homicide by abuse, is a specific charge under Washington state law that reflects not a single incident of violence, but a pattern. It is the charge that the law reaches for when the evidence shows that a child's death was not the result of one terrible moment, but of an ongoing, sustained pattern of conduct that was so severe, so prolonged, and so deliberate that it ultimately resulted in the child's death. It is, in the context of this case, the most accurate possible legal description of what Hannah Grace Rose Williams went through. The trial was long. It was painful in the way that all trials involving the deaths of children are painful, because the evidence that must be presented, the testimony that must be given, the details that must be laid out before a jury so that 12 ordinary people can understand what happened, requires that everyone in that courtroom sit with truths that are almost unbearable to hold. The other children who had lived in the Williams household were among those who testified. Medical experts explained to the jury exactly what prolonged starvation does to a child's body, how it depletes organ function and eliminates the body's ability to regulate temperature and leaves a child as physically vulnerable to exposure as an infant. The forensic evidence was presented in full. In 2013, the jury returned its verdict. Carri Williams was found guilty of homicide by abuse. She was sentenced to nearly 37 years in prison. Larry Williams, Hannah's adoptive father, was also convicted and sentenced for his role in what had happened inside that household. But it is Carri Williams who stands at the center of this case, identified by investigators and prosecutors as the primary architect of the abuse that took Hannah's life. Hannah Grace Rose Williams traveled thousands of miles for a chance at something better. She crossed an ocean. She left behind everything she knew, her country, her language, her culture, the landscape that had been the backdrop of her earliest years, and she came to Washington State with hope. She did not deserve what she found there. She deserved the life she came looking for. She deserved warmth and food and safety and the ordinary kindness that every child on earth is owed. She deserved to grow up. She deserved to become a woman who looked back on her childhood and thought about how far she had come. Instead, she died in the rain in a backyard in Sedro-Woolley. She was 13 years old. She weighed 58 pounds. She was alone. Her name was Hannah Grace Rose. She was someone's child. She was someone who mattered. She matters now. She will always matter. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour so that stories like Hannah's are never lost to silence. Your subscription keeps this channel alive and these stories told. Hit that subscribe button right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it means everything. Case 3. Charlene A. Dorcy. Into the Forest. Skamania County, Washington, June 12, 2004. There are crimes that exist at the absolute outer boundary of what the human mind is capable of processing. Crimes where the act itself is so far outside the range of what we expect from human beings, particularly from the people who occupy the most protective roles in a child's life, that something in us resists accepting them as real, even when the evidence is overwhelming and unambiguous and sitting directly in front of us. The case of Charlene Dorcy is one of those crimes. Because no matter how many times you turn it over, no matter how many angles you approach it from, no matter how carefully you read the charging documents or the sentencing transcripts or the reporting from the journalists who covered the case, there is no frame, no context, no explanatory lens that makes what Charlene Dorcy did to her daughters on June 12, 2004, feel anything other than utterly and completely incomprehensible. Charlene Dorcy had 2 daughters. Their names were Jessica and Brittany. Jessica was 4 years old. Brittany was 2 years old. A 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. 2 little girls who were, by developmental definition, entirely dependent on their mother for their understanding of the world, for their sense of safety, for the basic physical necessities of daily life. Children that young do not yet have the cognitive framework to understand danger in the abstract. They do not yet know that the world contains threats. They know only that the person closest to them is safe, and that where that person is, they are safe too. Jessica and Brittany knew only that their mother was safe. They trusted her with the uncomplicated, complete, unquestioning trust that only very young children are capable of. They went where she went. They followed her lead. They put their small hands in hers because that was what they knew to do, because that was what mothers and daughters do. On June 12, 2004, Charlene Dorcy took Jessica and Brittany into the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Skamania County, Washington. The Gifford-Pinchot is a vast and ancient stretch of federal forest land covering nearly 1.3 million acres in the southwestern part of the state, south of Mount Rainier and west of Mount Adams. It is a place of towering Douglas firs and deep green silences, of trails that disappear into tree cover so dense that daylight barely reaches the forest floor, of rivers and ridges, and the particular, profound quietness of old-growth woodland. In any other context, it is a place of breathtaking beauty. It is the kind of place that people drive for hours to visit, that photographers and hikers and families seeking connection with the natural world return to again and again. On that June day in 2004, Charlene Dorcy took her daughters there, and she shot them both. She shot Jessica, 4 years old, in the forest. She shot Brittany, 2 years old, in the forest. And then she left their bodies there, among the trees, in the silence of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, and she walked away. She walked away. The investigation that eventually led law enforcement to the bodies of Jessica and Brittany Dorcy in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest is a matter of public record, worked through the painstaking process that law enforcement employs when searching for missing persons in vast wilderness areas, combined with the eventual involvement of Charlene Dorcy herself in leading investigators to the location where she had taken her daughters. When authorities arrived at that location and found the 2 girls, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, shot, left among the trees, they were confronted with a scene that veterans of law enforcement still describe in terms of its emotional weight, its capacity to reach past professional distance and land somewhere deeply and irreparably human. 2 little girls, in the forest, shot by their mother, left there. Charlene Dorcy was from Vancouver, Washington, in Clark County, the southwestern corner of the state, directly across the Columbia River from Portland, Oregon. She was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Not second-degree, first-degree. The distinction matters enormously because first-degree murder in Washington state carries with it the element of premeditation. It means that the killing was planned. It was thought about in advance. The decision was made before the act was carried out. The prosecution's position, the position that the evidence supported, was that Charlene Dorcy did not snap in a moment of temporary psychological crisis and do something she had not intended. She made a decision. She took her daughters to the forest. She brought a weapon. She carried out what she had decided to do. She knew what she was going to do before she did it. On May 27, 2005, nearly a full year after the murders of Jessica and Brittany, Charlene Dorcy stood in a Washington state courtroom and entered a guilty plea to both counts of first-degree murder. She did not force the families of the victims. She was both the perpetrator and the closest family through a full trial. She did not make the evidence be presented piece by piece before a jury. She pleaded guilty. She acknowledged, in the legal forum designed for exactly that acknowledgement, that she had killed her daughters. She was sentenced to 63 years in prison. 63 years. For Jessica. For Brittany. For a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old who went into the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest with their mother and never came out. For 2 little girls who put their hands in their mother's hands because that was what children do, because they had no reason to know, no capacity to imagine, no framework to understand that the person they trusted most in the world was taking them somewhere they would not return from. There is no satisfying explanation here. There is no psychological profile that, once you read it, makes you set down the file and say, "Ah, yes, now I understand." There are legal documents and psychiatric evaluations and all of the clinical apparatus that the criminal justice system produces in cases like this one, and none of it answers the question that sits at the center of this case like a stone. Why? Why did Charlene Dorcy take her daughters into the forest? Why did she make this choice? What did she tell herself on the morning of June 12, 2004, when she got up and went about the business of preparing for what she had decided to do? What did she think as she drove toward the Gifford-Pinchot? What did she feel as her daughters sat in the vehicle beside her, trusting, unaware, completely and heartbreakingly safe in their certainty that their mother was taking them somewhere good? The justice system does not answer these questions. The sentencing documents do not answer them. 63 years in prison is accountability. It is consequence. It is the law doing what the law is designed to do. But it does not answer why. Jessica was 4 years old. Brittany was 2 years old. Their names deserve to be spoken in the same breath as the trees they were taken to and left in, because those trees are still standing and those girls are not. And that is the truth of this case that no amount of legal process or documentary coverage can undo. They deserve to grow up. They deserved everything that growing up holds. They deserve to come home from the forest. If this case has affected you tonight, please hit the like button and subscribe to Cold Case Hour right now. Jessica and Brittany's story is one that more people need to hear. Share this video, subscribe, and help us make sure these children are never forgotten. Case 4, Kyleah Rose Tolle. Left behind in Yakima. Yakima, Washington, February 25, 2025. There is a particular kind of tragedy that arrives not with a single violent act, but with an absence. With the gradual, accumulating withdrawal of the things that keep a person alive: food, warmth, care, attention, the basic human presence of someone who notices whether you are okay. The tragedy of neglect is quieter than the tragedy of violence, but it is no less complete in its consequences. And in some ways it is harder to comprehend because it requires not a single terrible decision, but a sustained, ongoing, daily choice not to act, not to provide, not to be there. The case of baby Elowen in Yakima, Washington is a case about that kind of tragedy. It is a case about what happens when a mother stops being present, first in spirit and then, quite literally, in body, and leaves her children to face the consequences of her absence alone. On February 25, 2025, officers from the Yakima Police Department were dispatched to a residential address in Yakima in response to a welfare check. Welfare checks are among the most routine calls in law enforcement. Someone has not heard from a neighbor. A family member is not answering their phone. A concerned party has noticed something that does not seem right and has asked law enforcement to go and verify that everything is okay. Most of the time, officers arrive and find that everything is fine. The person was sleeping. They were out of town. They had simply been out of contact for a little while. This was not one of those times. When Yakima officers arrived at the address and made entry into the residence, they found what would mark many of them: seasoned law enforcement professionals who had responded to difficult scenes before as one of the most harrowing things they had encountered in the course of their careers. Inside the home, in a bassinet in one of the rooms, was a 7-month-old infant girl named Elowen. Elowen was not moving. Elowen was not breathing. Elowen was dead. In the same residence, discovered in the course of the welfare check, was Elowen's 2-year-old sibling. The toddler was alive. But the condition in which that 2-year-old was found told officers immediately and unmistakably that this child had not been cared for. Not recently. Not adequately. Perhaps not for some time. The 2-year-old was severely malnourished. The kind of malnourishment that does not develop over a day or two, that does not result from a short period of inadequate care, but that accumulates gradually over an extended period of insufficient nutrition and attention. The kind of malnourishment that means a child has been surviving rather than living, subsisting rather than thriving, getting by on whatever minimal resources they could access rather than receiving the care that a 2-year-old human being requires. The mother of both children was a 20-year-old woman named Kyleah Rose Tolle. And Kyleah Rose Tolle was not there. When investigators located her, on February 28, 2025, 3 days after officers found her daughters in that Yakima home, she was at a campground. Not at a hospital. Not at a police station. Not on her way home. She was at a campground, away from her children, away from the residence where her infant had died and her toddler had been left alone and malnourished, and without an adult to care for her. She was 20 years old. She was the mother of 2 children, a 7-month-old and a 2-year-old, both of whom required her constant, daily, active presence to survive. And she had left them. She had physically removed herself from the home and gone to a campground and left a 7-month-old infant and a barely verbal 2-year-old behind. The investigation that followed her arrest worked to establish the timeline of events, how long the children had been alone, when Elowen had died, what the conditions inside the home had looked like in the period leading up to the welfare check. The answers that investigation produced were deeply troubling. Baby Elowen had not died suddenly in the immediate aftermath of her mother's departure. The physical evidence told a story of prolonged neglect, of conditions that had been deteriorating over time, of an infant whose needs had not been met in ways and over a time frame that went beyond a single absence. The 2-year-old's severe malnourishment confirmed that the deprivation the children had experienced was not a new development. It was the culmination of an extended pattern of inadequate care. Kyleah Rose Tolle was arrested on February 28, 2025, at the campground where she had been found. She was 20 years old. She was charged with first-degree manslaughter for the death of baby Elowen, a charge that reflects a knowing disregard for a substantial risk that a wrongful act may occur. She was also charged with first-degree criminal mistreatment, which under Washington state law reflects the knowing withholding of basic necessities from a child or dependent person, and with family abandonment. 20 years old is young. It is important to say that, not as an excuse, because there is no excuse for what Elowen went through, for what the 2-year-old endured in that house, for the conditions that officers found when they responded to that welfare check, but as a fact that sits alongside all the other facts in this case. 20 years old is not, by any measure, too young to know that infants require food and warmth and constant care. 20 years old is not too young to understand that a 7-month-old baby cannot survive without an adult present. 20 years old is not too young to know that if you are overwhelmed, if you are struggling, if you cannot provide what your children need, there are systems, imperfect systems, underfunded and overstretched systems, but systems nonetheless, that exist specifically to provide support or to take the children to someone who can care for them. She did not reach out to any of those systems. She went to a campground. Baby Elowen was 7 months old. She had been alive for less than a year. She had spent whatever portion of those 7 months in conditions of neglect and deprivation, and she died in a bassinet in a Yakima home while her mother was somewhere else entirely, and officers found her there. And the 2-year-old who had been her sibling and her only companion in that house was still alive only because her small body had managed, somehow, to survive long enough for help to arrive. The 2-year-old was removed from the home and placed in protective custody. That child has a chance. That child survived. But Elowen did not. 7 months old. Her name was Elowen. She deserved the entire world that she never got to see. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Elowen deserved someone to fight for her while she was alive. We can at least make sure her name is known now. Hit that subscribe button. Do it for her. Case 5. Janet Ernestina Garcia. 41 times. Everett and Pierce County, Washington, March 27, 2024. Numbers anchor us in true crime. They give us something concrete to hold on to when the broader facts of a case become too large and too terrible to hold in their entirety. The number 26 pounds anchored case 1. The number 58 pounds anchored case 2. The number 1,100 miles drove case 1 home in a way that no amount of descriptive language could. Numbers do something that words sometimes cannot. They land in the body. They make the abstract real. In case 5, the number is 41. And once you understand what that number represents in the context of what happened to 4-year-old Ariel Garcia on March 27, 2024, it will anchor itself in you in a way that will not easily let go. Ariel Garcia was 4 years old. His mother, Janet Ernestina Garcia, was 27. They lived in Everett, Washington, the county seat of Snohomish County, a mid-sized city about 30 miles north of Seattle on the shores of Port Gardner Bay, a community of working families and commuters, and the full, complicated, ordinary texture of American urban life. Ariel was 4 years old, which means he was at the age of why. The age of endless questions and spectacular imagination, and the complete conviction that whatever you believe right now is absolutely and unquestionably true. 4 years old is the age of favorite dinosaurs and imaginary friends, and the particular joy of a puddle when you are wearing rain boots. It is one of the most delightful ages that childhood contains. On March 27, 2024, Janet Garcia stabbed her son Ariel 41 times. 41 times. A 27-year-old woman in a home in Everett, Washington, stabbed her 4-year-old son 41 separate times. 41 wounds on the body of a child who had been alive for 4 years. 41 separate acts of violence against someone who had never done anything, could never have done anything, to deserve even one of them. The horror of this case does not end with the killing. Because what Janet Garcia did after she killed Ariel is what elevates this case into a category of deliberate, calculated cruelty that goes beyond even the act of the killing itself. She did not call 911. She did not surrender herself to police. She placed Ariel's body in her vehicle and she drove. She drove south from Snohomish County, down through King County, down through Pierce County, all the way to the area near Joint Base Lewis McChord, one of the largest military installations in the United States, a sprawling complex of bases and training facilities that covers a vast swath of land along Interstate 5 in Pierce County. On March 28, 2024, the day after she killed him, Ariel Garcia's body was discovered near Joint Base Lewis McChord, along the corridor of Interstate 5 in Pierce County. He was found in a public area. He was found by people who did not know him, who had no idea who he was or where he had come from or what had been done to him before he was left there. He was 4 years old, and he had 41 wounds on his body, and he had been driven across county lines and left by the side of a road, as though he were something that could simply be discarded. As though the problem of his existence could be solved by placing him somewhere far enough away from where it had been created. The investigation connected Janet Garcia to Ariel's death quickly and efficiently. She was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder, the charge that requires proof of premeditation, the charge that says this was planned, this was decided upon in advance. This did not arise from a single uncontrolled moment of rage, but from a decision that preceded the act. The charging documents included a domestic violence aggravating factor, reflecting the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim and the nature of the violence that had been committed. As of 2025, a Washington state court found Janet Garcia competent to stand trial. The legal process continues to move forward. The full resolution of this case, the trial, the verdict, the sentence, remains pending as of the most recent verified reporting available to us. But Ariel Garcia's story is already complete. It was completed on March 27, 2024, in an apartment in Everett, Washington, in the 41st of 41 wounds. It was completed when his mother put him in her vehicle and drove south. It was completed when strangers found him near a military base in Pierce County and had to figure out who he was and where he had come from and how he had gotten there. He was 4 years old. He deserved 41 years of life, not 41 wounds and death. He deserved every why question answered. He deserved to grow up. He deserved to find out who he was going to become. His name was Ariel Garcia. He was 4 years old. He deserved a childhood. If this story moved you, please like this video and hit subscribe right now. Cold Case Hour is committed to making sure that children like Ariel are never forgotten. Your support makes that possible. Subscribe now and share this video with someone who needs to hear these stories. Case 6. Sherrie Lynn Hill. The House of Silence. Silverdale, Washington, August 5, 2021. Most of the cases we cover on this channel, including the ones we have covered already tonight, involve very young children. Children who are 2 years old, or 4 years old, or 8 years old. Children who are not yet physically capable of leaving a dangerous home under their own power, who cannot dial a phone, who cannot walk to a neighbor's house and ask for help, who cannot articulate to a teacher or a doctor or a stranger on the street that something is wrong at home. The helplessness of very young children in abusive situations is heartbreaking, but it is also, in a terrible and practical way, understandable as a mechanism of victimization. We understand, even as we grieve it, why a 2-year-old cannot escape. The case of Connor Hill and Chelsea Hill adds a dimension of complexity and a layer of additional devastation to that dynamic. Because Connor and Chelsea were not 2 years old. They were not 4 years old. They were not even 8. Connor Hill and Chelsea Hill were 18 years old when their bodies were found in their Silverdale, Washington home on August 5, 2021. By the calendar, by the legal definition, by the standard measure that our society uses to determine when a person becomes an adult, they were adults. But Connor and Chelsea Hill were profoundly, severely autistic. They were both nonverbal. They did not use spoken language to communicate. They were both entirely, completely, wholly dependent on their caregiver for every single aspect of their daily lives. For food, for hygiene, for medical care, for any form of communication with the world beyond the walls of the home they lived in. Their age did not translate into capability. Their legal status as adults did not give them the tools to call for help or walk out the front door or go to a neighbor and explain what was happening to them. They were as dependent on their caregiver as any infant, as any toddler, as any very young child who cannot yet navigate the world without an adult guiding every step. Their caregiver was their mother. Their caregiver was Sherrie Lynn Hill. On August 5, 2021, Sherrie Lynn Hill walked into a hospital in Silverdale, Washington. She told the staff there that she was experiencing suicidal thoughts and needed help. In the course of the medical and psychiatric assessment that followed, the standard process for evaluating a person who presents in crisis at a hospital, she told staff something else. Something that stopped the assessment in its tracks and set off an immediate call to law enforcement. She told them that her children were dead at home. Law enforcement responded immediately to the Hill residence in Silverdale. What they found there was exactly what Sherrie Lynn Hill had said they would find. Connor Hill and Chelsea Hill, 18 years old, twins, both severely autistic and nonverbal, were dead inside the family home. The investigation that followed determined the cause of their deaths: starvation, prolonged, sustained neglect, a withdrawal of the basic necessities of life, food, care, the daily human attention that all people require to survive, and that Connor and Chelsea required more urgently and more completely than most. So severe and so sustained that it had resulted in the deaths of 2 young people who had no capacity whatsoever to help themselves. Sherrie Lynn Hill was 55 years old. She had been Connor and Chelsea's primary caregiver for the entirety of their 18 years of life. She had been the person who managed their daily routines, who provided their meals, who oversaw their care, who served as the interface between 2 nonverbal, severely autistic young adults and a world that they had no independent capacity to navigate. She knew, better than anyone, what they needed to survive. She knew, in a way that only an 18-year caregiver of severely disabled individuals can know, exactly what would happen if those things were not provided. And at some point, the investigation worked carefully and extensively to establish exactly when and over what period of time the care had ceased. She had stopped providing them. Not suddenly, not in one catastrophic moment of decision, but gradually, in the accumulating withdrawal of attention and provision that constitutes the particular cruelty of neglect. She had stopped doing what Connor and Chelsea needed her to do. And because they could not tell anyone, because they could not call for help or go to a neighbor or attract the attention of any system designed to identify children or vulnerable adults in danger, because the very disability that made them most dependent on her care also made them most invisible to the systems that might have intervened, no one knew. No one checked. The systems that exist to monitor the welfare of vulnerable children do not automatically extend to vulnerable adults, even profoundly disabled adults living in conditions of total dependency on a single caregiver. Connor and Chelsea fell into that gap. The gap between child protective services and adult protective services. The gap between a world that watches over children and a world that assumes adults, even severely disabled adults, have some capacity to advocate for themselves. They had no such capacity, and in that gap, they died. Sherrie Lynn Hill was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. In Washington state, second-degree murder requires proof of intent, proof that the person knew their conduct would result in death and acted anyway. Applied to a case of neglect, the charge reflects the conclusion that allowing 2 entirely dependent, nonverbal, severely autistic 18-year-olds to starve to death was not an oversight. It was not an accident. It was not the product of circumstances beyond Sherrie Hill's control. It was the knowing, deliberate withdrawal of care from 2 human beings who could not survive without it. The community of Silverdale and the wider Kitsap Peninsula community of which it is a part was profoundly shaken by this case. Because while cases of child abuse generate widespread public attention and urgent social response, cases involving disabled adults are chronically underreported, underdiscussed, and underscrutinized. The public discourse about protecting vulnerable people from the people responsible for their care tends to focus on children, and rightly so, but Connor and Chelsea Hill remind us that vulnerability does not end at age 18, that dependency does not end at age 18, and that the obligation to ensure the safety of those who cannot ensure their own safety does not end at age 18 either. Connor Hill and Chelsea Hill were 18 years old. They were twins who had spent their entire lives side by side, navigating a world together that was not always easy to navigate. They were nonverbal, which means they had never been able to call for help. They had never been able to describe their suffering to anyone. All they could do was endure what was happening to them, inside that house in Silverdale, while the world outside went on without any idea that they were there. Their names were Connor and Chelsea. They deserved care. They deserved warmth and food and the daily presence of someone who saw their full humanity, who understood that their disability did not diminish their worth or their right to survive. They deserve to live. Please like this video right now and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Connor and Chelsea's story is one that more people need to hear. Share it with someone today and help us make sure they are never forgotten. Case 7, Shannon McNease. 8 weeks old. Bremerton, Washington, August 7th, 2025. 8 weeks. 56 days. That is how long Shannon McNease's daughter had been alive when she was brought to the emergency room in Bremerton, Washington on August 7th, 2025. 8 weeks is not very long by any measure. By the time a baby is 8 weeks old, they have only just begun to emerge from the haze of the newborn period. They are just starting to track faces with their eyes. They are just beginning to develop the social smile, that first deliberate, responsive, heart-stopping smile that a baby gives when they recognize a face they know, when something in their still-forming brain lights up in recognition of the person who is their whole world. At 8 weeks old, a baby is not yet sure where they end and the world begins. They exist in a state of complete and utter dependency that is unlike anything a human being will experience again for the rest of their life. They need to be held and fed and kept warm and kept safe and surrounded by the kind of attentive, responsive care that their developing nervous systems require in order to wire correctly, in order to build the foundations of trust and security that all of human development rests upon. They need someone who is watching them constantly, who knows their rhythms and their cries and what each sound means, who would move heaven and earth to keep them safe. Shannon McNease's daughter needed all of those things. And when she was brought to the emergency room in Bremerton on August 7th, 2025, brought not by her mother but by her father, what the medical team found when they examined this 8-week-old baby told them, with the clinical clarity of medical evidence, that those things had not been provided. The baby had a brain bleed. In an infant this young, a brain bleed is a catastrophic finding. The brain of an 8-week-old is extraordinarily fragile and extraordinarily vulnerable. It is in the midst of a period of rapid, critical development. Trauma to the brain at this stage does not just cause immediate physical harm. It has the potential to affect the trajectory of that child's entire neurological development, to alter cognitive function and physical capability and the entire arc of who that child will become. A brain bleed in an 8-week-old baby is a medical emergency of the highest order, and it is also, when it is caused by trauma rather than by spontaneous medical events, one of the most significant indicators of non-accidental injury that pediatric medicine recognizes. But the brain bleed was not the only finding. This baby also had 20 rib fractures. 20. Rib fractures in infants are among the most reliable physical markers of abusive injury in the medical literature. The ribs of a young infant are not easily broken. They are pliant and flexible in ways that adult ribs are not, designed by the biology of infancy to withstand the ordinary physical handling that babies receive. Breaking an infant's ribs requires significant force that goes far beyond any form of normal or even rough but non-abusive handling. And 20 rib fractures, not 1, not 2, not even 5 or 10, but 20, told the medical team something even more significant than the severity of the force involved. It told them that this had happened more than once. Multiple rib fractures at different stages of healing is one of the clearest possible physical narratives of repeated, ongoing injury. When fractures are at different stages of the healing process, it means they did not all occur at the same time. It means some of them were older and some were newer. It means this baby had been hurt, and then, while still healing from those injuries, had been hurt again. The baby also had 6 metaphyseal fractures at the growth plates of her long bones, which pediatric radiologists specifically trained in child abuse medicine identify as among the most characteristic injuries associated with non-accidental trauma in infants. They are caused by forceful gripping and pulling and twisting of an infant's limbs in ways that no accidental fall or ordinary handling produces. The totality of this baby's injuries told a story. It was a story that the medical team read clearly and immediately. It was a story that pediatric specialists in child abuse medicine understood without ambiguity. It was a story of a baby who had been subjected to repeated, serious physical violence over the course of the first 8 weeks of her life. The investigation focused on Shannon McNease, the baby's mother. Detectives gathered evidence. They examined the medical records. They interviewed the father, who had brought the baby in. They built a case that, by September 4, 2025, they determined was sufficient to support criminal charges. On that date, Shannon McNease was arrested. She was charged with first-degree attempted murder and first-degree assault of a child. The charge of attempted murder carries specific legal weight. It means that investigators and prosecutors concluded that what Shannon McNease had done to this baby, the force applied, the injuries caused, the severity and the repetition of the violence, reflected not merely an intent to harm, but an intent that could reasonably be construed as lethal in its nature. The fact that this baby survived, that she was brought to the emergency room and received the skilled, urgent medical care that saved her life, is the only reason the word attempted precedes the word murder in those charges. Shannon McNease was a mother in Bremerton. Bremerton is a city of about 45,000 people on the Kitsap Peninsula, home to Naval Base Kitsap, a community defined in large part by its relationship with the military and the working families who live and work in its shadow. She was, in the eyes of anyone who saw them from the outside, simply a new mother caring for a newborn at home. Behind closed doors, according to the evidence gathered by investigators, she was inflicting the injuries that were found on that baby's 8-week-old body. This baby survived. That has to be said, because it matters enormously. Because in a documentary filled with children who did not survive, the survival of this baby is meaningful and significant and worth celebrating. She was brought to the right place. The medical team that received her was skilled and thorough and relentless in providing the care she needed. She lived. But she lived having spent the first 8 weeks of her existence on this earth being hurt, repeatedly, by the person who was supposed to be her safe harbor. She lived carrying the physical evidence of that harm in her body. She lived because someone else stepped in when her mother did not. She deserved to have never needed that intervention. She deserved 8 weeks, and 8 years and 80 years, of nothing but safety. Shannon McNease faces first-degree attempted murder charges. Her case continues through the Washington state legal system. And this baby, this 8-week-old, unnamed in reporting to protect her privacy, but real and present and alive, has a chance at a future that the system is working to protect. She deserved a mother. She deserved all of it. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour right now. Your subscription, every single one. Make sure we can keep giving voice to the children who cannot speak for themselves. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Case 8. Joelene Louise Rodriguez. The Sacrifice. Seattle, Washington, October 16, 2025. Of all 10 cases in tonight's documentary, Case 8 is the one that most completely resists any attempt at rational comprehension. In most of the other cases we have covered tonight, the perpetrator's motivation, however monstrous, however inexcusable, however far outside the boundaries of acceptable human behavior, at least exists somewhere within the recognizable range of human failing. Neglect driven by addiction. Neglect driven by selfishness. Rage that exceeded all boundaries. Violence that escalated beyond any point of return. These explanations do not excuse anything. They do not make anything better. They do not give back a single one of the children we have named tonight. But they are, at least, comprehensible as human failures. We can trace the shape of them even as we condemn them. What Joelene Louise Rodriguez allegedly told investigators about why she killed her son does not exist within that range. It exists somewhere outside of it entirely. Jackson J. Rantala was 4 years old. He was autistic and nonverbal. A little boy who moved through the world according to his own particular sensory and communicative experience, who understood things and felt things and existed in the world in ways that required patience and learning and a deep, committed willingness to meet him where he was rather than where it was easy for others to be. He was the kind of child whose care required extraordinary attentiveness, extraordinary consistency, extraordinary love. He was 4 years old and he was entirely dependent on the adults in his life for everything, for his food, his safety, his routine, his medical care, his well-being, his survival. He was entirely dependent on his mother. On October 16, 2025, in their Seattle apartment, Joelene Louise Rodriguez stabbed Jackson multiple times and left him to die in the bathtub. He was 4 years old. He was autistic. He was nonverbal. He could not run. He could not fight back. He could not call for help. He could not do anything at all to protect himself from the person in whose hands his entire life rested. He was 4 years old, and he was completely defenseless, and the person attacking him was his mother. When investigators spoke to Joelene Rodriguez, when they sat across from her and asked the question that law enforcement must always ask, regardless of how terrible the answer might be, she allegedly told them that she had received a directive, that she had been told, by some voice or force or spiritual communication that she understood as external to herself, that she needed to sacrifice her child, that the killing of Jackson was required, that it was necessary, that it was something she had been instructed to do. Whether that explanation represents genuine psychosis, a complete break from reality of the kind that constitutes a recognized psychiatric condition, or whether it represents something else entirely, is a question that the courts and the psychiatric evaluators working with this case are tasked with determining. The legal process will assess her mental state, will evaluate the evidence of her psychological functioning in the period leading up to the killing, will determine what weight to give to the explanation she offered, and what that explanation means for the charges she faces. That process will take time. It will be thorough. It is designed to be thorough. But what is not subject to evaluation or interpretation or the findings of any psychiatric assessment is what happened to Jackson. He was stabbed. He was left in a bathtub. He was 4 years old, and he was nonverbal, and he was autistic, and he was entirely defenseless, and he died in his own apartment, in a city of 700,000 people, and no one knew. No one was there. No one came in time. Joelene Louise Rodriguez was 45 years old at the time of the killing. She was charged with first-degree murder with premeditated intent. The charging documents included 2 aggravating factors: deliberate cruelty and vulnerable victim. Both of those factors apply in this case in the most complete and literal possible sense. Jackson was as vulnerable a victim as exists, a nonverbal 4-year-old with autism who had no capacity to protect himself, alert anyone, or survive without the person who killed him. And the nature of his death, stabbed by his own mother in his own home, left in a bathtub, satisfies every element of deliberate cruelty that the law is designed to recognize and respond to. Seattle on October 16, 2025 was a city going about its business. People were working and commuting and meeting friends and making dinner and living their lives in all the ordinary, unremarkable ways that make up the texture of daily urban existence. And somewhere in that city, in an apartment that looked from the outside like every other apartment, Jackson was dying. And no one knew. He had never been able to call for help. From the moment he was born, from the moment his autism and his nonverbal status became apparent, he had existed in the world without the capacity to tell anyone what was happening to him. All he had, the only protection he had ever had, the only resource he had ever been able to access, was the people responsible for his care. And the person most responsible for his care was the person who killed him. His name was Jackson J. Rantala. He was 4 years old. He deserved someone who would learn his language, who would sit with him and figure out how he communicated, how he understood the world, what brought him joy and what brought him distress. He deserved someone who would meet him exactly where he was and love him from that place. He deserved a childhood that was full of the particular, intense, specific wonder that children on the autism spectrum often experience the world through. He deserved to live. If this story has affected you, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every single subscription helps us continue this work. These children need people willing to stand up and say their names. Be one of those people. Subscribe now. Case 9, Ashlee Montana Creighton. 5 days. Seattle, Washington, May 18th to May 23rd, 2024. 5 days. In the context of a human life that runs its full intended course, 5 days is almost imperceptibly brief. It is the distance between one Monday and the following Saturday. It is a long weekend. It is the blink of an eye in the span of any life that gets to be the length a life is supposed to be. For Ashlee Maria Creighton, 5 days was not a blink. It was not a long weekend. It was not a brief passage of time between one thing and another. For Ashlee Maria Creighton, 5 days was everything. It was the entirety of her existence on this earth. From her first breath to her last. From the moment she arrived to the moment she was taken. 5 days was her entire life. Ashlee was born on May 18th, 2024, in Seattle, Washington. Her mother, Ashlee Montana Creighton, was 33 years old. Ashlee was living at a transitional housing facility in Seattle, a hotel that had been converted to serve people experiencing homelessness and active substance use disorders, part of the network of social services that Seattle, like many large American cities, maintains in an attempt to provide some form of shelter and support to some of the most vulnerable people in the community. The fact that Ashlee Creighton was living in such a facility tells us something important about her circumstances at the time of Ashlee's birth. She was in crisis. She was without stable housing. She was actively dealing with addiction, a disease that alters brain chemistry and impairs judgment and makes the business of daily life enormously, sometimes insurmountably, difficult even for people who are trying their hardest to overcome it. None of that is presented here as an excuse. It is presented as context, as the reality of the circumstances into which Ashlee Maria Creighton was born on May 18th, 2024, and that shaped what the next 5 days of her very short life would look like. Ashlee died on May 23rd, 2024. She was 5 days old. When the medical examiner conducted the autopsy and the associated toxicology analysis on this 5-day-old infant, the findings that came back were unambiguous and devastating. Ashlee Maria Creighton had died from the toxic effects of methamphetamine and fentanyl in her system, two of the most dangerous substances in the current American drug crisis. Methamphetamine and fentanyl, a stimulant and an opioid, both extraordinarily harmful to adult systems and catastrophically lethal to the developing system of a newborn infant, had been present in Ashlee's body in concentrations that caused her death. The medical examiner also identified malnutrition as a contributing factor, meaning that in her 5 days of life, in addition to the substances in her system, Ashlee had also not been receiving adequate nutrition. The findings of the toxicology report answered one set of questions and raised another. The presence of methamphetamine and fentanyl in Ashlee's system could have occurred through two primary pathways: exposure in utero during Ashlee Creighton's pregnancy, which would have resulted in the substances crossing the placental barrier and entering the developing baby's system before birth, or exposure in the postpartum period through breastfeeding, if Creighton was using substances and breastfeeding simultaneously. The investigation worked to establish the specific mechanism and timeline of Ashlee's exposure. What the evidence made clear was that the substances were there, that they were present at lethal concentrations, and that they were there because of the choices Ashlee Creighton had made. In September of 2024, Ashlee Montana Creighton was charged with second-degree murder and criminal mistreatment. The charge of second-degree murder, applied to the death of a newborn through drug toxicity, reflects the legal system's determination that exposing a newborn infant to lethal concentrations of methamphetamine and fentanyl, whether through prenatal exposure or through breastfeeding while actively using, or through some combination of both, constitutes a knowing disregard for the life of that infant. It is the law's acknowledgement that these substances did not appear in Ashlee's body spontaneously, that they were not there by accident, that they were there because of what her mother chose to put into her own body in the periods surrounding Ashlee's birth. Addiction is a disease. That must be said clearly and without equivocation, because it is true. It is the scientific consensus. It is the medical reality. Addiction changes the brain in ways that make stopping extraordinarily difficult, even when the consequences of not stopping are visible and devastating. People who are in the grip of active addiction are not simply making bad choices in the way that a person who knows better and has full access to their rational faculties makes a bad choice. They are in the grip of a condition that compromises the very cognitive processes that would allow them to choose differently. That is real, and it is important, and it deserves to be said in any discussion of a case like this one. And alongside that truth, in the same breath, another truth must also be said. Ashlee Maria Creighton was 5 days old. She had not chosen anything. She had not done anything. She had arrived in the world helpless and brand new and entirely dependent on the adult around her to make the choices that would keep her alive. She deserved 5 years, not 5 days. She deserved the chance to grow up and know her own name and develop her own personality and find out what kind of person she was going to become. Her name, Ashlee, comes from Greek mythology. It means star maiden. Ashlee was the goddess of justice and innocence, a celestial figure associated with purity and the starry night sky. It is a beautiful name. It is the name of someone who was supposed to be here for a long time, who was supposed to grow into it, who was supposed to carry it through decades of a life that was entirely her own. She carried it for 5 days. She was born in a transitional hotel in Seattle, Washington, and she died there 5 days later, and the cause of death was written in a medical examiner's report in clinical language that does not do justice to the enormity of what it represents. A life that lasted 5 days. A person who came and went before the world had any chance to know her. Ashlee Maria Creighton. 5 days old. A star maiden who deserved an entire sky. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Ashlee's story is one of thousands unfolding across this country right now. We tell them so that they are not forgotten. Subscribe, share, and help us make sure these children's names are never lost to silence. Case 10, Denaya Young. 1172. Seattle, Washington, January 30th, 2025. We have saved the last case for last deliberately. Not because it is the most recent, though it is among the most recent cases in this documentary. Not because it is the most legally complex or the most procedurally intricate, but because it contains a number that, once you hear it in its full context, becomes impossible to unhear. A number that does something that the most carefully constructed narrative cannot always do on its own. A number that lands in you like a stone in still water and sends ripples outward that do not stop. That number is 1172. Jameer Demetrius James Robinson was 14 years old. He lived in South Seattle with his mother, Denaya Young, who was 29 years old, with his stepfather Kyleah Graham, and with 3 younger siblings who were also present in the home. 14 years old is a particular and significant age in the arc of a childhood. It is the early years of high school. It is the age where adolescents are beginning, sometimes awkwardly and sometimes with surprising confidence, to form the identities that will carry them into adulthood. It is the age of strong opinions about music and strong feelings about fairness and the particular, passionate certainty that the adults around you do not fully understand the world or your place in it. It is an age that contains enormous amounts of possibility, enormous amounts of becoming. Enormous amounts of the unfolding that is the great work of adolescence. The slow, sometimes painful, always significant process of figuring out who you are and who you want to be. Jameer Robinson was 14 years old, and he was in the middle of that unfolding. He was a teenager in a South Seattle home, living the daily life of a child who was old enough to have homework and opinions and arguments with his parents and all of the ordinary friction of family life that is, in a healthy household, simply the texture of raising a teenager. He had younger siblings who looked up to him the way younger siblings always look up to their older brothers and sisters. He had a name, Jameer Demetrius James Robinson, that his family had given him, that meant something, that was supposed to follow him through decades of a life that was just beginning to open up. On January 30th, 2025, Denaya Young beat Jameer for over 3 hours. The reported reason, documented in charging papers and confirmed across multiple verified news outlets, was that Jameer had not completed his chores. Chores. Household tasks. The ordinary, daily, completely unremarkable friction of family life that every parent and every teenager everywhere navigates every single day. The kind of conflict that most families resolve with a raised voice and a consequence and a lesson learned in a day that ends and then a new day that begins. In that South Seattle home on January 30th, 2025, it did not end that way. Denaya Young used an HDMI cord and an extension cord. She beat her 14-year-old son for more than 3 hours. 3 hours is a long time. It is not a moment of rage that got out of control and escalated before anyone could stop it. It is not the terrible, swift violence of a single loss of control. 3 hours is sustained. 3 hours requires effort that is renewed, again and again, over an extended period of time. 3 hours is a choice that is made not once, but continuously, over 180 minutes, while a 14-year-old boy is being beaten in his own home. At the end of those 3 hours, Jameer Demetrius James Robinson was dead. When the King County Medical Examiner conducted the examination of Jameer's body, they did what medical examiners always do. They cataloged the injuries. They documented every mark, every wound, every area of trauma on the body of this 14-year-old boy. And when they were finished, when the documentation of what had been done to Jameer Robinson over the course of those 3 hours was complete, the total number of separate injuries identified on his body was 1,172. 1,172 injuries. On one body. On the body of a 14-year-old child. On the body of a boy who had been alive for 14 years and who died in his own home because he had not finished his chores. Let that number sit with you the way it deserves to sit. 1,172 is not a number that belongs in a medical examiner's report. It is not a number that belongs in the context of a human body and the violence that was done to it. It is a number so large, so staggering in what it represents, in the sustained, relentless, prolonged application of force to a child's body over 3 hours, that something in the human mind resists accepting it as real, even when the document is right in front of you. Even when you have read it 3 times. Even when you know, beyond any doubt, that it is accurate. It is accurate. 1,172 separate injuries on the body of a 14-year-old boy beaten to death with HDMI and extension cords by his mother because he had not done his chores. 3 younger siblings were in the home that night. 3 children, younger than Jameer, who were present somewhere in that house while their older brother was being beaten for over 3 hours. What those 3 children heard, what they experienced, what they carry now from that night in January of 2025, that is something that no one outside of their direct caregivers and therapists will ever fully know. What we know is that they were there. What we know is that they lost their brother. What we know is that the home that was supposed to be their safe place was the place where 1,172 injuries were inflicted on a 14-year-old over the course of 3 hours. Denaya Young was charged on February 4th, 2025, just 5 days after Jameer's death, with second-degree murder. The speed of the charging reflects the clarity of the evidence and the conclusion it supported. Kyleah Graham, the stepfather, was also charged in connection with the case, reflecting investigators' assessment of the dynamics inside that household on the night Jameer died. Second-degree murder in Washington state, as we have discussed in earlier cases tonight, requires proof of intent, proof that the person knew their actions were likely to result in death and acted anyway. 3 hours of beating a 14-year-old with electrical cords until he is dead satisfies that standard in the most complete and unambiguous possible way. The law said so 5 days after Jameer died. The charging document was unequivocal. Jameer Demetrius James Robinson deserved to grow up. He deserved to finish the adolescence he was in the middle of, to get through the difficult, turbulent, significant years of the teenage experience, and come out the other side as the adult he was becoming. He deserved to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. He deserved to have opinions and make mistakes and learn from them, and look back years later on the person he was at 14 with the fondness and the mild embarrassment that adults feel when they remember their teenage selves. He deserved to be an older brother who was there for his younger siblings as they grew up. He deserved to have arguments about chores that ended the way arguments about chores are supposed to end, with a consequence, with a lesson, with tomorrow being a new day. He deserved to come home from school on January 31st, 2025. He deserved a February. He deserved a future. 1,172 injuries. For chores. His name was Jameer Demetrius James Robinson. He was 14 years old, and he deserved every single thing that growing up holds. Please like this video right now and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Jameer's story needs to reach as many people as possible. His name needs to be known. Your subscription, right now, today, make sure we can keep telling these stories, keep saying these names, keep shining a light into the darkness. Subscribe, share, and drop a comment below telling us which case has stayed with you tonight. We read every single one. If you have made it to the end of this documentary, first, thank you. Genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Because what you just did was not a small thing. Sitting with these stories, giving your time and your attention to these children, choosing not to look away when looking away would have been so much easier. That is not nothing. That matters. And I want you to know that before we say goodnight. Now, if you are not yet a subscriber to Cold Case Hour, I want to ask you, right now, before you do anything else, before you scroll to the next video or close the tab or put your phone down, please hit that subscribe button. It is right there. It takes 2 seconds. And what it does, in practical terms, is make sure that the next time we sit down and tell a story like the ones we told tonight, you are going to be one of the first people to hear it. Turn on your notifications too, because we never want you to miss a case. Not one. And if this documentary moved you, if something in it landed in a way that you are still feeling right now as these final words are coming through your speakers, please leave a comment below. Tell us which case stayed with you. Tell us which child's name you are going to carry with you after tonight. Tell us what you are thinking, what you are feeling, what this brought up for you. We read every single comment that comes into this channel. Please share this documentary. Share it widely and share it without hesitation. Share it with someone who cares about justice the way you care about justice. Share it with a teacher who works with children every day and needs to be reminded of what is at stake in every classroom. Share it with a social worker who is in the trenches of this fight every single day and who deserves to know that what they do matters and that people outside of their profession are paying attention. Share it with a pediatrician, a neighbor, a parent, a friend. Anyone who needs to be reminded of why the safety and the well-being of children must always, always be the priority. In our homes, in our communities, in our institutions and our laws, and in the quiet, daily, unglamorous texture of the way we treat the most vulnerable people among us. So from all of us at Cold Case Hour, thank you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. Thank you for caring about these children enough to sit with their stories and carry their names forward into the world. We will see you in the next one. And until then, please like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs to see it, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a case. Cold Case Hour. We never let them be forgotten.